Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to today's launch of the Natural Security Forum. I'm Kevin Cosgriff. I'm a Stimson board member, and I'd like to offer a few introductory comments about the center. For over a quarter century, the Stimson Center has worked to find peaceful outcomes in an unstable world. I like to think about the center as being in the risk identification and risk mitigation business, especially since, as this audience knows, if you leave risks unattended, they have the nasty habit of becoming real threats. From regional studies to nuclear security and WMD non-proliferation to protecting civilians in combat spaces, Stimson brings a nonpartisan, multidimensional, and integrative approach to everything they do. Importantly, the high-quality researchers at Stimson pride themselves in not only identifying and defining pressing risks and threats, but in walking the terrain of their study area, in most cases literally. In turn, this allows them to craft pragmatic options for decision makers that are suitable to the contours of that terrain and feasible to be executed. Such is the case with the Natural Security Forum, which has begun a systematic exploration of the intersection of environmental depredation and crime and national security at the local, U.S., and international levels. This idea is elegant in its simplicity, but the problem is complex in its nature and pressing. To help us with this, Stimson's assembled a distinguished group who will be introduced in a minute to help us on our way today. Thank you for coming. We look forward to your active participation this afternoon and during the course of the forum. It's now my great privilege to introduce Stimson's gifted researcher who's leading this effort, Johan Bergenäs. Johan.
Thank you so very much, Admiral Cosgriff, and thank you all for being here. My name is Johan Bergenäs, and I'm a senior associate with the Stimson Center. Really happy to be kicking off an effort, the Natural Security Forum, but really we've been working on this for many, many years. And the Stimson Center, through a very unconventional way, got involved in rhino preservation in Kenya in 2013. And we got some very terrible news the other day through a WhatsApp message from one of our project collaborators. 2 rhinos have been killed in the sanctuary under the cover of darkness. I don't have all the details yet, but it is likely that under the cover of darkness, the poachers entered the park. They found their prey, they shot it dead, they sawed off his horn, and entered the park undiscovered. At the Mombasa highway waited likely collaborators in a car to take the rhino horns down to Mombasa port. And in that port, the facilitation of the horns to Southeast Asia and China, probably, the same people who are facilitating the drug trade, the arms trade, and the human trade took care of this commodity as well. So I think this story represents the multi-billion-dollar wildlife trafficking threat that we're facing that includes some of the world's worst transnational criminals. So when a rhino is killed in Kenya in a sanctuary, that's natural security for us. We have also for several years been working with National Geographic on what we have started to call the world's largest crime scene, which is our oceans and the illegal fishing that takes place in the, I believe, Admiral Stafford, is the deep land, as you call it. And so it is very important to us because when a government subsidizes its fishing fleet, sends it out to steal other countries' resources, sometimes with the protection of its security forces, that's natural security. Similarly, when terrorists like the FARC turn away from the drug trade and into the illegal gold mining, that's natural security. And finally, when the Mexican drug cartels and rebels in Central Africa get involved in logging and illegal logging industry, that's natural security. So those are the 4 topics: mining, logging, wildlife, and illegal fishing that we're going to try to cover. And that illegal business is second only to the drug trafficking trade, and we think an understudied and understood area of work. And there are literally thousands, as my colleagues know all too well, incidents where environmental crime connects with US national and global security. We know this because we are tracking them as part of our forum, and we are analyzing them out of a US national security perspective. Another pillar, and I understand you have some handouts here, so I'm not going to go over all of the work that we're going to do over the next couple of years, but another important pillar of this work is to find the most influential and smart military and security and political leaders to grow the community of natural security advocates. And I can't think of a better person to, in a couple of seconds, offer some remarks than Admiral Jim Stafridis, who have spent 12 years at sea, I learned recently, and he's out later this year with a new book on sea power. And I am very pleased to I don't want to steal your thunder, but to recognize that there will be some natural security passages, or if not, even a chapter on that. So we want to get it right at Stimson. So last June, I went up to see Admiral Stafridis, who is the dean, of course, at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And I wanted to go up and see him so that he can judge whether we have recalibrated or calibrated the Natural Security Forum correctly. And I was extremely pleased that he signed off on the concept and told us to go execute it. And one of my rules of thumb is that when the former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO tells you to do something, you better do it, and you better do it with passion and intensity. So with that, Admiral, I'd like to invite you, and thank you very much for being part of this.
Well, let me start by getting the microphone down to a normal person's height. Always a challenge for me anytime I take over a microphone. Johan, thank you for that very kind introduction, and Admiral Cosgriff, thank you as well for the connection with Stimson, which is an organization I've come to admire greatly. You know, we're in the Army-Navy Club, and so I can't resist beginning with a little Army-Navy story. And as many of you may know, Navy has won 15 of the last 16 football games played between Army and Navy. So you may not know this, though. Army and Navy decided that they would, because it was so unbalanced in football, that they would decide the outcome of the Army-Navy rivalry by a contest in ice fishing. So this winter, a team from each Army and Navy went out on a frozen river and they began ice fishing. And at the end of the first day, Navy had caught 55 fish and Army caught 0. At the end of the second day, Navy caught 67 fish and Army caught 0. And the Army guys were very discouraged because this was a 3-day event. They knew they had to overcome it, so they sent a scout to the Navy camp to find out what was going on. And he did that. He used all his Army Special Forces techniques, and he observed the Navy ice fishing camp. And he came back very excited. And he reported to the Army team that, "I knew it. Those bastards are cheating. They have cut a hole in the ice." So I mentioned that in the context of fishing, which is my topic today. And I think that's a little bit of what Johan and his team seek to do here in a metaphorical sense, is to cut a hole in the ice. In other words, to cut through and do something that once you do it seems so obvious. And that is to make the connection between the kind of criminality that Johan described in 4 discrete areas, and our national security, this confluence of natural security and national security. So I'd like to take just 10 minutes and kind of tee up 4 questions with the hope that this marvelous panel can address some of these ideas. But I want to start with a very key one, and it's a simple and an obvious one, and it's, is natural security truly part of global security, part of our national security? I think the answer is unquestionably yes. Johan gave you some pretty good examples, but think of it this way in terms of fishing. This is a $250 billion a year industry, and 1 in every 5 fish that comes out of the ocean is taken illegally. This is an enormous discontinuity, and it is a potential income stream for a wide variety of malefactors. And just as is the case with narcotics, as is the case with blood diamonds, the other aspect of this is the transit of these illicit goods establishes surreptitious routes. And if you can bring 10 tons of cocaine into the United States in a semi-submersible, if you can bring a hold full of illegal fish in, what else can you put in that conveyance? Can you put a weapon of mass destruction? Can you put cash? Can you put a terrorist? Absolutely. So this convergence of criminal trafficking routes with the idea of moving terrorists and illicit goods, I think is one obvious kind of concern that we should think about. Secondly, are these natural security issues worthy of inclusion in this bigger budget, this bigger concept that we have of national security? And I would argue very much so. In addition to the 2 items I just mentioned, the funding piece and these dangerous routes that are created, the third piece of this is the geopolitical tension that arises out of this kind of activity. When Admiral Cosgriff and I were junior officers in the Navy, back when we both had hair, we would take cruises to the Pacific, and we would see illicit fishing from China, interdicted by coast guards from Vietnam, from the Philippines, and we see that pattern continuing today. Geopolitical tension that arises out of, in the case of my subject, illegal fishing. That kind of geopolitical tension today is still at play throughout the South China Sea, and indeed in the East China Sea as well. So there you have 3, I think, significant reasons: the routes, the funding, and the geopolitical tension that I think all would tell us that we need to pay more attention to this particular zone. And I'll do a little offshoot to simply say that as various nations are undertaking these kind of activities, both countering illicit fishing and enforcing norms of fishing, it is very possible to use those maritime zones for what many have called hybrid warfare. Little green men we talk about in Europe, unmarked combatants who flow into an area, as Russia flowed them into Ukraine, Donbass, and Crimea. I would think over time we're going to see hybrid warfare at sea. Little blue sailors, if you will, unmarked, who are interacting in ways that could create a casus belli for a large nation that wanted to create a controversy, the geopolitical piece of this. So those, I think, are the 3 key issues that I would look at as I think about this importance of natural security with national security. Third question, what do we do about it? How do we operationalize a response? Well, this is why I'm very proud to see my good friend, the Vice Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard here, because I think the Navy has a role to play, but I think this one is in this gentleman's wheelhouse from a military perspective. And here I would say, as we operationalize a response to this kind of illegal fishing, the first level of doing so is international cooperation. So how is the U.S. Coast Guard interacting with Coast Guards around the world? There's a very good story to tell, as the Admiral knows, and I hope that can come up in the conversation. That kind of international cooperation, I think, could be powerful. A second example of that is counter-piracy. If we think about the way NATO, the European Union, India, Pakistan, even Iran, as Admiral Miller knows very well from his time in command of Fifth Fleet, can agree on counter-piracy, can work together. It is quite conceivable that nations could agree and come together against illegal fishing or other forms of crime on the oceans. So I think part of operationalizing our response includes working with our Coast Guard to internationalize efforts. A second response is interagency work. And again, I would point to the Coast Guard, which sits inside an organization that is kind of the ultimate interagency animal, DHS, where my very good friend General John Kelly will be coming, taking his experience from U.S. Southern Command to put in place, and I think we're going to see a center of real intellectual and operational activity come out of the Department of Homeland Security, which could be channeled in this part of the conversation. Finally, in terms of a response, I would say private-public cooperation. How can we get organs of government to work together with the private sector? What is the role of the huge shipping companies here? If only in monitoring, observing. What is the role of the commercial fishing companies? What is the role of purchasers of seafood? Are they requiring, knowing that what they receive is not, if you will, a blood diamond of the sea, but rather a legitimately caught part of the bounty of the oceans? So international, interagency, private-public, I think, are the three approaches that we should think about. Last question, what is the message? What is the message? And here, I think, we look at what the Stimson Center is doing in helping us craft a coherent message to face these kind of challenges, and then turn around and publicize it. Johan has already put out several podcasts, several articles. What other centers are doing so? I pledge right here, right now, that the Fletcher School, where we have just created a Maritime Center of Studies, will be taking these issues forward. Who else is writing? Who else is thinking? Who else is making this connection? I think it is crucial that we craft the message and move it forward on what Johan has called the world's largest crime scene, and the chapter in my book is called The Outlaw Sea, because more crime is committed in the oceans than anywhere else in the world on a dollar for dollar value. So there's some initial thoughts to get us started in these deliberations. To summarize, I would simply say that natural security is part of national security. It's not the central driver, but it's I think, an important part. Secondly, we can and should address it using international, interagency, and private-public mechanisms. Thirdly, we need to talk about it. We need more conversations about it. because of the three strands of danger that I have mentioned here today. The money that comes out of illicit activities, the routes, and the inherent geopolitical tension. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Admiral, for framing this conversation for us. I wanted to make sure that this was a conversation because the Natural Security Forum is a forum and not a project for a reason, and that is that we want as many of our friends and colleagues in this field to actually participate. And so I would just, number one, welcome anyone in this room and folks who are listening in on the Facebook live feed to be in touch with Stimson on this topic. Mm-hmm. But the other part is that I want this conversation not to be between me and Jim. So I am going to open the floor right away to questions, and if you are shy to go first, I will throw a question at the Admiral, but really this is up to the crowd to take the next step here. So we already have a taker here, and there is a microphone coming your way, sir.
I was just, hello, Admiral.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah.
I was just wondering if pollution at sea,
Mm-hmm.
does that fit into your categories? Because that's something we're all aware of when we get out a few miles.
Absolutely. And I hope that Stimson will connect with the environmental piece of this, which is in fact crucial. And here, the health of the oceans, the acidification of the oceans, pollution, salinity, global warming, which is opening the polar caps, all that is kind of backdrop to the criminal activity that Stimson is focusing on. I think over time, those two strands of thought, the illicit human-driven activity and the natural effect of human industrial activity are going to cross. And in the end, the Amazon is not the lungs of the earth. It's really the oceans in the end.
Thank you very much. Amanda, I think there is a lady to your right.
Thank you very much. Jim Marisa, Marketing Strategies. I have a question around if you know of any effective public-private partnerships that have been effective in combating illegal wildlife trade?
Illegal wildlife trade. I think there are some. I'll give you three examples. One is in the rhino world, and I think Jeremy can probably talk to some of this, but in the rhino world, you are seeing the beginning of commercial activity that makes it impossible to purchase the product. The same idea that I mentioned with fish. You're seeing the beginning of that, somewhat in China, somewhat in other markets, but that I think is a very nascent kind of activity. A second example in terms of wildlife preservation is some of the larger shipping lines, Maersk for example, are participating in implanting sensors in their ships that are allowing measurement of wildlife movements at sea. And a third private-public type of partnership is one that we see in the global hunting context, which is ensuring that safari hunting is better regulated. We end up with better conservation applied to it. But I think the point of your question and the point of my response is that these are all very, very beginning stages, and this is an area where I think there needs to be a great deal more emphasis. Thank you.
There's a question in the front row here.
Well, it's more a comment.
Please.
The same thing would be where fishermen join with fish services around the world for specific fish stock management on a voluntary basis, and most times increase the yield by doing it while preserving the resource.
Exactly. Thanks, Admiral.
Okay, there seems to be a prevalence on this side of the room here. Admiral White is next.
Ali.
It's good to see you again.
Nice seeing you. This is a proud graduate of the Fletcher School, by the way, although this is not a planted question. I have no idea what he's going to ask me.
I was wondering if I may ask two quick questions. One,
Sure.
I was wondering about your thoughts on sort of the context of your remarks as related to the Arctic and its
Sure.
challenges. And when you mentioned internationalizing cooperation, I was wondering if you saw this as perhaps an opportunity for the United States to finally get around to adopting the UN Convention on Rights.
Yeah, that really does sound like a planted question. On the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, yes, yes, and yes. I mean, it's absurd that the United States has not ratified it. There's a long, rich history of commentary on this. I myself have testified at least 3 times on that subject. We came very close to ratifying it several years ago. That's fallen away. I think it's unlikely with the Trump administration looking at their general proclivities. It would appear to me unlikely that we're going to see that in the near future. So the United States will have to continue to rely on, as we have now for decades, on customary international law, the activities of other nations, even older traditional ideas of high seas freedoms and so forth. So unfortunately, not a big connection there. In terms of the Arctic, leaving for a moment the fishing piece of this, I think the Arctic actually represents an opportunity as a zone of cooperation. If we look to the Antarctic and the history of cooperation there going back really a century, there are many lessons and norms I think that ultimately could be applied to the Arctic. The problem is the state of tension that currently exists between Russia, which has the largest front porch up there, and the 5 NATO nations that all have the second largest chunk. The United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. So while we have the state of tension between Russia and the United States, I think, and NATO and the United States, I think it's going to be difficult, Ali, to really move in a cooperative direction. But let's wish those away for a moment and say that here's a logical place, relatively unspoiled, where I think interests roughly align. All nations, including Russia and the other Arctic nations, have a vested interest in an environment in the north that is open, that allows trade to move freely, that protects the environment, that shares resources equitably, that has effective search and rescue, that can effectively conduct what I'll call science diplomacy. I think there's actually a fairly rich basket of possible cooperative activities in the north. So if I were advising the Trump administration and they are looking for zones of cooperation with Russia, which they may well be, I would say this would be one. And I think let's see what happens. There has never, for example, been an Arctic summit in human history. Why not have a summit of Arctic leaders to address all of this? And I think it would be a way to take this idea of natural security and move it into the zone of national security by making the Arctic a zone of cooperation, not a zone of competition or, God forbid, a zone of conflict. I'll close on that by saying if we're going to do that from the U.S. perspective, for God's sake, let's build some more icebreakers. How many do we have, Commandant? 1.5?
We have 2 operating right now and 1 broken.
Yeah, 2.5. So Russia operates 27. China, which has, last time I checked, no Arctic territory, operates 14. Denmark, a tiny nation, very respectable one, operates 7. We have 2.5. We need to get on that if we're going to have natural as well as national security. I think my time is up. We're going to turn to the panel.
I have to give Admiral White here the final question, then otherwise I'll get in trouble. He's a good friend of ours.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Sir, as you talked about the international cooperation that's needed to get out of this problem of IUU fishing on the high seas, as we wrestle, as we know that one key to that is information sharing. We've got to be able to share information on maritime domain awareness, on what's happening on the ocean from all the countries involved of it. But we're in this time where we have this unfortunate tension between information sharing and information security and cybersecurity, as we've been all too well reminded in recent days. So we sort of, as we want to share information with partners, that opens up our vulnerabilities to some degree of the networks that we and our close allies have. Do you see any way to resolve that, or any sort of innovative thinking that might get us beyond this tension and allow us to do the type of information sharing that's going to be required to solve this problem in the future?
Terrific question. I'll give you sort of two responses to it. One is to kind of turn the question around slightly and say, my view, that this is an area where we can decide to let down some of these barriers and share information. In other words, it's a lot more comfortable for nations to share fishing stock data than code that can be used to hack into the electric grid. This is less secretive, less dangerous, less explosive, and again, it's an area that people broadly agree on, recognizing there are geopolitical tensions and cod wars and things like that. But I would sort of flip your excellent question and say, in response, here is an example of an area that we can cooperate in and therefore build confidence and perhaps over time cooperate in more difficult and more challenging. And I'll close that segment of the response by saying I've seen this in person, and it was in counter-piracy. And I know Admiral Cosgriff will recall very well, and Admiral Miller will recall the counter-piracy efforts taking place off the Horn of Africa, where we saw not only NATO, not only the EU, but Russia, China, Iran, and we shared data about piracy and flow of ships. So it can be done, and by building confidence, I think there are possibilities. The second answer to the question, I think, is a technological one. It is finding better ways to protect data using technologies like data bit splitting, where we take all of our environmental and sensitive ecological data, we share what we want to share, and we protect the remainder by splitting the data, and cyber gets technical beyond that. But the point is using technology to parse data to ensure that the parts you want to share are shared and that your defense remains intact. In other words, a final way to think about it is when we think of cyber defense today, it's kind of like the man in the moon suit. We're trying to kind of cover up our body completely so no germs get into it. That's a bad way to try and live in the real world. What you really need are antibodies and antivirals inside the system. That's data bit splitting. That kind of technology can allow you to have a permeable membrane on what you want to send out and protect what stays behind. Thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to the maestro.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Admiral Stefanius is heading home tonight, but he has said, I think, that he will join us briefly for the reception. At one point, you can ask him whether he is willing, or the Navy is willing to share resources with the Coast Guard, since that organization's mission rich and resource poor, and that would be a tricky one. And maybe also a question about whether President-elect Trump spoke of anything that had to do with natural security during Jim's meeting up in New York. We'll see if we get that. Before we get going and introduce a very interesting and unconventional panel when it comes to environmental topic, I briefly want to just say that we are so thankful at the Stimson Center to a couple of organizations who has decided to invest in our mission. The Walton Family Foundation, National Geographic, the UK government, and a number of other players in this room who are coming on board as the springtime gets going. So very, very thankful for me and the entire center. We have a great panel, and there's a panel that has evolved a little bit over the last couple of weeks. But one of the missions of our work is to try to get voices into this debate that maybe would not otherwise be in it. You've just heard a couple of them, and we will continue with that this afternoon. And again, I want this to be a conversation between you all and our friends at the stage here, which is Eric Schmidt, who covers terrorism and national security topics for the New York Times. Diana Rosen, who is a specialist in international crime and narcotics at the Congressional Research Service. And Jeremy Young, who is a senior investigative producer with Al Jazeera and just released a new documentary about the rhino horn trade in southern Africa. When I, as late as I was in preparing for this panel on Wednesday night, started to do last-minute Googling on my panelists, I started with Eric. And my first question was going to be, because I was sure when I was going to read his recent reporting that I was going to find a story on Mosul, a story on ISIL in a different context, maybe a trip you made to the Baltics to understand U.S. force buildup in that part of the world. And lo and behold, on January 11th, he wrote about natural security, at least the way we at the forum here defines it. So why don't I just tell you, for the people who don't read your stuff every day, the connection about this, what the story was about and how it connects to the work that we're trying to do.
Well, thank you, Johan, and thank you for inviting me here to be a part of this panel. The article that Johan is talking about is a piece that my colleague C.J. Chivers and I wrote about Iranian smuggling, specifically arms smuggling the Iranians have been conducting now for some time into small arms and weapons getting into mainly Somalia and into Yemen, and basically helping to fuel the fighting on the ground there, weapons going in particularly to the Houthis. And in our research, what we found is, going back through our sources, is that some of the way the Iranians were operating is about a year and a half ago, they tried to take some of these weapons in one of their own boats, one of their own vessels, and they were turned away. And so they turned to other means. They turned to, in this case, the boat that we talked about was a dhow, basically a traditional fishing boat that's used throughout the region. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them throughout the Gulf and in the regions around that part of Africa. And what was, in this case, was the international maritime community has organized an effort to combat this. And one of the ships that we wrote about in this article was an Australian warship called the Darwin, which in February intercepted one of these dhows, which was loaded with thousands of weapons, mostly AK-47s, but also some rocket-propelled grenades and other weapons that would obviously help fuel the conflict when they got aboard. But when I was in the Gulf just a few weeks ago and talked to Admiral Donegan, the head of the Fifth Fleet, one of Admiral Cosgriff's successors there, he mentioned to me that many of the people involved in this smuggling were out-of-work fishermen, basically. They were just trying to make a living. They're not part of this international Iranian arms cabal or anything like that, but they are part of a local network that the Iranians and their intermediaries in the region have been able to tap into. And so this was an important, I think, distinction that we tried to draw in this article, that there's this network out there. And in studying terrorism, as I have over the last 10 years or so, one of the real revelations as we came to writing about Al-Qaeda and now about ISIS and others is that you really have to understand terrorist groups as networks. And to basically go after these networks, you have to break them into pieces. And this part is the logistics piece of essentially a network. It's a state-sponsored network. And how you go after that and to break it up.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating data point, because one of the arguments that we always make with regards to networks and with regards to fishermen turning to other ways of supporting themselves, there's about 50 million of them in the world, and I think that the national security community would be would struggle a lot with having a huge influx from some of these agricultural and fishing sectors into the transnational organized crime behavior that Eric and others have been writing about. Jeremy.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Jeremy and I ran into each other a couple of months ago. He's a pretty good tennis player, side note, as is Jim Stafridis. So we play tennis every now and again, and we talk natural security. And I have become fascinated with his work on poaching in a new documentary, as I mentioned. But you actually used to be spending a lot of time in the Pentagon as a reporter. And my question to you is, in your previous job covering defense and security issues, and in your current job, and please do a short introduction of the documentary to put all of this in context. What's the overlap? Or did you just get tired of going to Virginia?
It's interesting. Admiral Stavridis talked about the convergence of a lot of different topics, and I think we started out on this investigation. So we did a 6-month investigation into the rhino horn trade, and we focused on undercover assets to expose the techniques and tactics that are used by the criminals. And I think we started off thinking that this was going to be an environmental story. I mean, I know I did. And very quickly we found ourselves delving into all of these different areas. I mean, some of the things we've already talked about, like weapons trafficking. So we had information on Czech hunting rifles that were coming into Mozambique and across the border into South Africa. Human trafficking, we had criminal syndicates that were operating brothels and massage parlors and for purposes of sex trafficking. We had political corruption and corruption at low levels and high levels, border crossings, airports, anywhere where the criminal syndicates needed to move their product, they figured out a way to circumvent the authorities. One thing I want to add, just sort of given the expertise in this room, and this is not the area that I work in, but it's something that became very evident to me with regards to national security, is it's such a good entry point for government-to-government cooperation. Now, whether that's mill-to-mill or whether it's through intelligence agencies coming together to cooperate, it's such an area where you can build relationships and you can build trust and you can get to know people and you can have successes. And then from there, you can kind of move on and figure out, well, what other areas can we cooperate in? What other things can we work on that meets our needs? So it really makes sense to me, this concept of national security, overlapping into so many different areas and being something that's so valuable to look at.
Thank you. Can you also, one of the other pieces of your work that I'm fascinated about, I was trying to perhaps articulately tell a story about the supply chain from a very sad incident here a couple of days ago. I did not touch on, I don't think that I touched on the sophisticated nature of those levels that I try to connect. Can you just kind of give us a rundown of what you found in your reporting of that?
So for wildlife trafficking, and this was something that I was not familiar with, but there's 5 levels to the criminal networks that move wildlife products from different parts of the world to other parts. So you have level 1, very low level, people with guns and axes who cross into parks, kill the animals, extract the products. You have level 2, we call them local gang masters, who are local criminals who have access to money, access to transportation, access to public officials that they can bribe. And then they move those products to level 3 traffickers, where we were working in Mozambique and South Africa, largely Vietnamese and Chinese traffickers who are linked with the triads and other well-known transnational organized criminal syndicates. And they move their products up the chain to level 4 traffickers, who are located in these foreign countries in Vietnam and China and some other places, mostly around Asia. They import the products, and they have, again, political connections. They have connections at airports. They have ways to get these products into the country. And then they move them to the sort of level 5 traffickers, which are the individuals who are sort of selling the product at the very end. And just to give you a quick story about how ruthless some of these criminal syndicates are, this is a technique that I wasn't familiar with, but in order to corrupt low-level park officials, for example, in South Africa, one of the techniques that these criminal syndicates use is they direct deposit money into the bank accounts of very poorly paid park officials. And they then approach those officials and say, you've received a direct deposit of this amount of money, here's the paperwork. Now, you can either work with us and help us locate rhino in your park and let us know where they are, or I'm going to send this paper to your boss, and he's going to suspect that you're engaged in bribery and illegal acts with criminal syndicates. And it's just a very ruthless tactic and technique, and that's at a pretty low level. So it just gives you a sense of how these criminals work and how the networks work and how creative and sophisticated they are.
Thanks, Jeremy. So we're going to turn to Congress. And I look out over the room and I see a number of congressional staffers in the room. And I know a few of their bosses actually wanted to be here, but apparently there's a busy time up on the Hill. But we were able to get Leanna Rosen down here, a distinguished member of the Congressional Research Service. Help us, and you as we introduce you as transnational organized crime is your beat. Does the United States Congress get this business of environmental crime in a strategic sense?
So I would say that Congress recognizes environmental crime as an issue. It has abundant laws on the books, powerful laws too. There are agencies and offices that are empowered to enforce those laws, prosecute violators, and cooperate internationally. The question of whether environmental crime is framed under the rubric or within the context of national security is a different question. I think Congress has addressed it in specific ways. I think the two most successful entry points so far have been first with respect to threat finance, looking at the financial nodes and how the environment, crime, and ultimately the profits of that can benefit bad actors that we care about from a national security perspective. That's been a very useful way to convey the story and the importance of the issue. Another way that it has sort of gained traction, I think, is through transnational organized crime, through the narrative of that, really, which got boosted at the U.S. federal government level with the 2011 strategy to combat transnational organized crime, explaining how environmental crime can be, at times, not necessarily always, a transnational organized crime issue, and then linking that to the national security implications of it has been really a way to convey that story. I think it's really challenging, though. I think there's a challenge in telling the story in a convincing manner and also showing how ultimately those links turn back to national security concerns, weak and failing states, corruption, rule of law, border insecurity, terrorism, conflict. That's an area that I think Congress and the U.S. government and probably most governments in the world are struggling to sort of create that narrative and understand then how do we respond to it.
It seemed you did a very great job at explaining a very convoluted, what seems like a very convoluted structure with regards to this issue. How do we move that forward? Does it have to come through pressure from the executive branch in terms of including some of these themes in maybe our national security strategy, our strategy for transnational organized crime, or how do you untangle this narrative vis-a-vis Congress, of course?
Right. I think I can just draw on some past examples of how it's happened. So going back to, for example, that 2011 strategy that I referred to, the transnational organized crime strategy, it didn't actually refer to environmental crime as a national security threat. There's no reference to environmental crime in it. But in response to that, and in response to reporting on wildlife trafficking, etc., there was a lot of activity to raise questions about it. President Obama issued an executive order, and in it, it explicitly said, the interagency needs to go back and check to see whether or not wildlife crime really warrants to be incorporated into that transnational organized crime strategy. So I think, as more information comes up with specific issues, specific threats, that could be a way to incorporate it into sort of that broader discussion. And national security or environmental crime can seem at the outset really broad. And I think there needs to be also that sort of deeper fidelity in understanding which specific threats are warranted as national security concerns and which ones are not.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then we will open it up for a few minutes for questions from the audience. But my last question goes to you, Eric. You are sometimes on the ground with the forces. Sometimes you cover it from the Pentagon and elsewhere. This is obviously an evolving threat and an evolving story, if you will. In your estimation over the last 10 years or even further, is the U.S. military good at adjusting to these very complex and ever-moving challenges? Is there any stories that you can share with us?
Yes, there are, and I think it's an evolving situation. I think we've heard from all the speakers today. My first introduction to this as a topic that senior military officers were worrying about was a trip that I took with Carter Ham, who's here today. Carter and I were traveling in Niger in early 2013, ostensibly to look at the threats that are plaguing West and North Africa, AQIM and such. But during one of our conversations on the trip, I was asking what else he was worried about, and he was ticking things off. And he told me about how his staff and had briefed him, and now he had come to appreciate the threat from poaching. And the two-pronged threat, really. You have what the concern about, as we've talked about, and Jeremy's very clearly articulated, the threat of when you have the poaching the products themselves, which are financing extremist groups and perhaps even terrorist groups. But perhaps on the other flip side of this is that you have, in the case of the rhinos, for instance, you have very valuable natural resources for countries that have game parks. And if those animals are killed and the game parks are not as attractive to foreign tourists, those countries are going to lose that kind of revenue. And as Leanna was just talking about, weak and failing states is something I've got to worry about all the time in my beat. And so I'm looking at what are the causes for those kind of things. And natural resources, natural security, if you will, whether it's poaching in the case of Africa, or whether it's perhaps more direct threat, and you look at the natural resource of oil in eastern Syria, that's a vital lifeline for the Islamic State, and how it took the U.S. military a better part of a year to kind of figure out how do we go after this valuable resource without destroying a lot of the infrastructure that we want to keep in place for when the day ISIS is gone, and also we don't want to alienate a lot of local tribes by killing a lot of the truckers. This took a lot of very deliberate planning to understand how does this infrastructure actually work, how does the oil distribution work, and how do you target these nodes so that you deprive the Islamic State of revenue, but at the same point, hopefully leave enough infrastructure in place. So I think these are popping up in other places. If you look at Yemen, for instance, a country that is actually running out of water right now, and how that, no doubt, is one of the many problems that country faces. And if you're a military commander and you're looking at these things, what are the things that a terrorist group or extremist group or just the political activities, what are these people going to exploit on the ground? Those are the things military and policymakers are going to have to look at very seriously as we move forward. And I think as you see more and more failing states, underlying many of those failing states happen to be questions of natural resources. Perhaps not the main one, as I think Jim Stavridis pointed out, but something that the military and the American policymakers are going to have to focus on more and more.
Let's continue the conversation from the floor. There is a question to the left from Kathleen.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Newland, member of the Stimson board. I wanted to ask a question about the role of the military sort of from the other perspective, which is when the military is a major perpetrator of natural resource crimes, I think in Burma and Indonesia, illegal logging and so on. What kind of influence are Western and other militaries capable of having on their counterparts in that sphere? That's probably a question for Eric and you.
Why don't you start, Eric, and then I'll say that's what I was going to say.
I think as the American military looks at some of the partners that it has, obviously there are various standards that they have to meet. And I think when you get into this kind of area of environmental degradation or any kind of corruption, I think that's where perhaps even parts of the Leahy Amendment might kick in, where you've got, they could lead to things like the human rights abuses and things that trigger Leahy and those kind of things. So I think military commanders, as they're having to work, particularly in this administration, where the strategy for a lot of these conflicts on the ground was to work by, with, and through local armed armed forces or security forces, this becomes problematic. I think of Nigeria, for instance, and the trouble that you have and the number of troops the U.S. is hoping to work with, and yet lately issues were coming up in terms of how much cooperation could the American military have with these forces that were essential in trying to combat Boko Haram, for instance. So I think these are the kind of things, if you're dealing with corrupt militaries, wherever they may be around the world, and you're going to have Congress, no doubt, looking into this. You're going to have you have the media looking into this, and the very legitimacy of that cooperation and those partnerships is going to be undermined if those things aren't, if those kind of things aren't cleaned up.
For the national security perspective on that topic, please visit our Medium blog, hosted on Medium through our Stimson website. Over to Sherry over here. Okay, we'll do you and then we'll do Sherry.
Channing May, Global Financial Integrity. What role do you see the global financial shadow system, things like anonymous shell companies and tax havens, what role do they play in national security or in perpetuating it?
Jeremy, do you want to touch on that?
No, I mean, the idea, anti-money laundering concepts come into play quite a bit in this arena. I think it's a great area for cooperation for whether it's U.S. Treasury or other U.S. government agencies to work with foreign partners to figure out on something that is, not so controversial, right? If we're dealing with wildlife trade or we're dealing with some of these national security issues, finding common ground to work on, to look at techniques and tactics that people are using to move products and to move money. And wildlife products in themselves have become a product that is used to pay someone else in a foreign country. And so they figured out ways to not even have to move loads of cash from point A to point B if you're able to pay someone with ivory tusk or with some other product. So I think it's an area that could be a really good area of cooperation for figuring out specific techniques and tactics that are being used.
Amanda brings the microphone. One of the things, there's plenty of lessons learned here. Believe it or not, but I used to cover WMD non-proliferation, and my friends in that field, they think I've gone soft with my rhino stories. But my boss, Brian Finlay, the CEO and president of the center, one of the premier scholars on that topic, could tell you that there's tons of story after the AQCon network about illicit finance and shell companies and networks that we can learn from in approaching evolving issues. And sometimes I would imagine it is as easy from to go over to the office over in the Treasury or Commerce or State or Defense. So my 2 cents. Now over to Sherry here in the front, Amanda.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you to Stimson for taking on this very important topic. Thank you, Admiral Stavridis, Cosgrove, and the panel. I appreciate all that you've been doing here. I recall 20 years ago when I was in the Pentagon being invited to a meeting with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Chief of Defense of Botswana, whose main mission at the time was protecting against illegal poaching in Botswana. And I had the privilege of visiting that country and some others just recently, and saw how diligently they are protecting the rhino and the elephant. And in Zambia, saw 4 armed guards protecting, 4 armed rangers protecting 2 rhino, who track them 24/7. And I know of those stories in South Africa where they're paid off, and the rhino population is much larger, so there's much more targeting even there. And I've seen that our military, in the initiatives in the last recent years, particularly on the IUU fishing, has really gotten engaged to combat this. And I think we have there's a lot of capability and willingness and interest across the government, particularly in the Coast Guard. I'd like to ask the panel, first, thank you for continuing to highlight this, because I think as national security reporters, getting these issues into the mainstream is continuing to be important, particularly in the coming era. Admiral Stavridis raised the public-private partnership, and I think that bringing the private financing and the the private sector into this is going to be incredibly important. We can marshal all the government resources and the goodwill and the capability, but we need additional capacity. That tale from South Africa and others we know about, it's going to take a lot more than just the mill-to-mill cooperation, which I think is great and very important. But I'd love for you to talk about what you've seen from your own experiences about how we can marshal the private sector financing.
Can I, Leanna, ask you to comment on that from a congressional point of view? Some of the laws that you mentioned, some of the initiatives, to what extent is the private sector in partnership with the public sector a factor in that?
So the U.S. government has farm assistance available to combat various types of environmental crimes. In FY 2016, for the State Department appropriations, the State Department received $80 million to combat wildlife trafficking. So there's funding available, and to the extent that that funding is used to support grants and other types of projects in source zone countries where wildlife trafficking may occur, or in demand countries where there's a lot more research that is being done on trying to figure out the nature of the consumer and the buyer, or in transit countries, how it's being moved from source to ultimate consumers. There's an opportunity to benefit from the knowledge that already exists in the non-government world. I think just starting in the wildlife trafficking issue, maybe let's say a decade ago, 5 years ago even, there was little resident knowledge in the U.S. government to understand it, and there was an important and dependent relationship between the U.S. government and outside groups to figure out the nature of the issue with investigators to understand sort of the scope of the problem. So to the extent that that is useful in a public-private partnership kind of way, I think that continues to go forward, and USAID and the State Department are thinking really hard about finding ways to harness outside groups' knowledge. I think there are some examples in the wildlife trafficking realm. For example, using technology, mobile technology, to report incidents of trafficking, report incidents of poaching that may occur, and using sort of outside platforms to do that, but then translating that information and using it to benefit the U.S. government's response, or for the U.S. government to then share it with a host nation. I think that's occurring. That's one example.
Thank you so much. We're gonna do more Q&A, but we're gonna do it over a cocktail out the door here. There is a reception for us, and the questions, unless someone feels really passionate about adding another voice to share his question, I'm gonna close it off. I'm gonna welcome you out to the reception area, and I will close with obviously thanking the panelists for joining us on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Admiral Stafridis, Admiral Cosgrave. What did I say? They're all the same to me. I just work. And on that note, I want to take just a quick moment, as I brought my phone, and say thank you to Brian Finley and the Stimson Center, which maybe it's important to remind ourselves that we are a national security think tank. And it takes quite a bit of courage from the center and its new leader to say, go and run with this topic and see what you can find and what you can do. So I want to thank you, Brian, and the center for that. And then quickly, everyone who helped us put this event together, Amanda and Emma and James, the other James, Miles, Jim, and if I'm forgetting anyone, I'll buy you a drink later. But thank you so much for coming, and please join us for some cocktails. Thank you. Bye-bye.